to those kind of things makes for more efficient mentor-mentee relationship, fruitful relationship in your work settings.
Some of the early psychologists who were considered fathers for, at the risk of sounding sexist, of the notion of Chicano psychology, they actually had, and they came from psych and education, described essentially what you're talking about as cognitive flex. So this ability to manage between contexts, essentially, and it seems that the thing that alerts your mind, even if it's unconsciously, to make a shift is some stimulus from the environment, a person's face or the way they're talking, or a situation that there are expectations for, but there's always some cue, right?
Absolutely. And then it goes like, so in this case you try to apply a theory to kind of real life setting, a rich cultural experience. What to me is interesting also is how when you do that, you kind of enrich your understanding of the basic processes of how the mind works. Like initially social cognition was not that social, right? It was applying models that were developed in the cognitive science with, it's about people, it's about the self, that kind of stuff. And as we apply that to, again, more complex world, we realize that, oh, the mind can do things that are way more complex, or the interconnection between the environment, the culture, and what you do with bits of information are, again, a lot more complex than simply a simple model that is the same for everyone. There's tremendous variability, not just in the content of your thoughts, but in the very processes by which you make decisions, you process information, you learn in the classroom. So that to me has both applied perspective when you teach, for example, students that are very heterogeneous on all kinds of dimensions, and also in terms of the basic knowledge about the human mind. So again, I'm always going back to this idea that you cannot separate the psychological from the social. Those two things build one another. So to me, a better science of the human mind needs to factor in that.
So what you've done effectively and very efficiently has been able to add a layer of complexity to a conversation that we've had in class. As we talked about ethnic identity and these cultural values, and even a little bit of a touch of acculturation. Where we left the class last was talking about how cultural influences thoughts and behavior. And now, with this notion of biculturalism and social cognition, we've added a whole other layer to that complexity, because on the surface it assumes, okay, and then the product is X. But social cognition says the product can be X, Y, and Z depending on the situation. So one person could draw on the cultural influences in different ways at different times. Right?
Absolutely.
Yeah. I wanted to be able to circle back because I think it's important for the science of our discipline to talk about how do we know. And this is where I think your stuff in particular is fascinating to me, and I hope our students find it fascinating as well. We talk about how you might actually study this interplay between conscious and unconscious cultural expressions. I think that's where I'd like to have you just kind of explain how you as a scientist kind of get at that.
So let's start with the conscious part. That's the easiest one, right?
Okay.
If for example, we've done several studies where we ask people to identify the two cultures that are most important to them, and to list things that they associate with each culture. And then you can ask people directly, okay, you give me some input, tell me, how strongly you identify with those various things. And so I could indicate, that culture is very important to me, the things that are related to that define who I am. What I'm measuring then is your very explicit, deliberate knowledge, right? I'm asking you to introspect, to reflect, and to indicate on a scale, on a computerized questionnaire, how you feel about that. That would tap your explicit bicultural identity in this case. And then to get at the other piece of the puzzle, the more automatic portion of your self-knowledge, I could present to you on a computer screen the very words that you generated, right? And so you would be asked, for example, to indicate whether they associate to, let's call it the Mexican-American culture, or whether you associate to whatever the other culture could be the Puerto Rican culture, if you have heritage from those two cultures. And so you would be able to differentiate them very quickly, and at the same time you would also be asked to differentiate words that are related to yourself, like pronouns such as I, me, mine, and words that are typically used to describe other people, they, them, others, right? And so you do this speeded categorization task under two different configurations. Like in one case, me would be on the same side as the Mexican-American culture, and not me would be on the same side as the Puerto Rican culture. And so you do the speeded categorization task, you see a me words, it goes on the left, Mexican-American term on the left as well, the opposite for the not me words and the Puerto Rican terms that you were generated. And so that would measure the connection between self and the Mexican-American culture. And then I could ask you to do the same task, except that now I would switch the way the two pairs of concepts are combined. Now, me is on the same side as the Puerto Rican culture, not me is on the same side as the Mexican-American culture. And by comparing how quickly you can do this speeded categorization task, I could infer that me, for example, is more strongly connected to one of those cultures than to the other. Or maybe that you are equally strongly identified with both of those things.
Yeah.
And so depending how you set this up, you can measure those cultural identification independently. But the idea is that the ease, the speed at which you can do those things can be used to infer something about this implicit knowledge, right? In this case, how strongly you link the self to those cultures. So in that case, I'm not asking you directly how you feel about that. I'm kind of deriving some information based on the quickness of your response. So that's one of the techniques that has been used today, and that shows that in some case, again, you can tap things that may or may not be aligned with what you said more directly. And again, not to imply that this is the true self and this is just a make-up narrative. No, I think both of those things are very important. Simply they reflect that the self is likely to operate in a very deliberate, conscious manner, but also in a relatively automatic manner. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and then I know, but we don't have time to go into it, but I know then you take that basic premise and you can start playing with different ideas about when you might be able to bring about a stronger sense of self or the words that are associated with that particular culture or ethnicity through this technique.
Exactly, and like for example in the work that we did together, we had people complete the task either in Spanish or in English. Mm-hmm. So the concepts were the same, but the pattern of response was different. So that suggests that the self is also embedded in the language, or you have kind of a different self depending whether you think in Spanish or you think in English. And that points to the very important point that you were making earlier about the flexibility of those stuff, depending the context, or in this case the language. Yeah. That's a different self-definition that comes to the surface.
And what I really like about that is that people who have recognized that they are bicultural, mm-hmm. they have an explicit expression of that biculturalism that they feel is very conscious. I will shift, I will change, mm-hmm. I will mm-hmm. speak differently or mm-hmm. act differently. And what I think people don't recognize unless they're familiar with this social cognition work is it's also operating at an unconscious level.
Exactly.
Sometimes beyond your control. Mm-hmm. And it's just fascinating to know that that's part of the lived experience mm-hmm. of being a bicultural person on some level.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I think that's perfect in terms of helping us kind of really kickstart a conversation about bilingualism and biculturalism mm-hmm. And how social psychology and social cognition in particular have implications for our course topics and the lived experience of Chicanos and Latinos. So I just wanted to say thank you for doing that for us.
Really enjoyed the conversation. Nice talking about you.
Thanks so much.
Take care.
I hope I got all that. Okay, good. You're still in frame.